Russia in Daniel 11, Part 4. In the vision of Daniel 11, we saw in Part 3 that the king of the north had reclaimed most of the known Grecian empire when he overflowed and passed through the territory of the king of the south. The ambitious Antiochus the Great, the sixth ruler of the northern kingdom, had after a short pause returned to continue his expansion, capturing numerous Egyptian strongholds in Coel Syria, the last region towards the borders of the king of the south. Closer and still closer, Antiochus the aggressor advanced towards the borders of Egypt, the very fortress of the king of the south's kingdom. However, the king of the south, now Ptolemy Philopator, had for some time been aroused at the possibility of the king of the north invading his country, Egypt. And now in verse 11 of Daniel chapter 11, Ptolemy, the king of the south, is finally moved to action to put in check the progress of the king of the north by war. Ptolemy Philopator, feeling threatened at the prospect of the danger before him, comes out of Egypt to meet the king of the north with a large army. It is important to notice that Gabriel describes the king of the south as moved with choler, which means angered by provocation. Ptolemy was not only moved to anger because of the losses he had sustained when Antiochus the Great overflowed into the king of the south's union of countries, but now he was also being provoked by the expansion of the king of the north towards his fortress, which had now reached the very porch of his country. Troubled by the security threat that this posed to Egypt and the prospects of an imminent invasion of his own country by the king of the north, Ptolemy Philopator comes out of Egypt with his army. After a 5-day march crossing over the border, the king of the south reaches a short distance from the aggressor's camp, not far from a region in Coel Syria called Raphia. Antiochus, on seeing the king of the south's army approaching, then moves in closer, and for a while the two armies of the king of the north and the king of the south both encamp opposite each other, preserving their distance. A series of small skirmishes and scuffles around the perimeter of each army occurred during the 5-day wait until the real battle finally begins by a charge of elephants. Ptolemy went first into battle, then Antiochus followed, doing the same. The subsequent war described in Daniel 11 verse 11 between the king of the south and the king of the north is considered one of the largest battles between the north and the south in the ancient world. Occurring on the 22nd of June 217 BC, not far from Egypt's border in a field by the city of Raphia, this came to be known as the Battle of Elephants. At first, Antiochus's army seemed to be successful, having captured many of Ptolemy's elephants. Now, with the entire right wing of the Ptolemaic cavalry in retreat, the king of the north pursued the king of the south, thinking the battle was won. But the very existence of the king of the south's kingdom was at stake here if Ptolemy lost the war, and the southern army held out until suddenly the tide turned. By the time Antiochus returned to the field, his own center had broken and was in disarray, and the king of the north, seeing his whole army in full retreat, was forced to retire in Raphia. The battle was lost. The Battle of Raphia went down in history as a great Egyptian victory and one which secured Ptolemy's kingdom. During the battle, a multitude of around 10,000 infantry was slain by the hand of Ptolemy's army, compared to just 1,500 lost from the king of the south's infantry. And so, in the words of verse 11, the multitude of the king of the north's army was given into the hand of Ptolemy. Immediately after the battle, the king of the north sought a truce to bury the dead and then returned home to his kingdom. Ptolemy then took without resistance Raphia and other towns each community seeking to resume its allegiance to the King of the South. Now we will see Daniel's reputation for repetition as we come down to our day. We saw in the repeat of history so far that the King of the North today expanded through NATO up to the very borders of Russia in a striking similarity to Antiochus, the King of the North, when he returned and was stirred up to the borders of Egypt in the very last part of verse 10. Just as Antiochus expanded his territory towards Egypt up to the region of Raphia, the very last city towards Egypt's border, so the United States of America through NATO has expanded eastwards towards Russia since the collapse of the Soviet Union up to the region of Ukraine towards the Russian border. The NATO pledged countries on Russia's borders today includes Lithuania, Latvia and Estonia. However, none of these countries compare with Ukraine, which shares the largest western border with Russia, a border of 1,282 miles. Due to its location, the possibility of Ukraine becoming part of NATO causes a serious security threat to Russia. Just as Ptolemy was for some time aroused by the major security threat to Egypt due to the expansion of the King of the North towards his borders and the prospects of an imminent invasion of his own country, so Vladimir Putin has been aroused for many years at the threat of NATO reaching his borders and Ukraine's aspiration to become a NATO country, which increases the prospects of danger for Russia. Just as Ptolemy was provoked by the advance of the aggressor, the King of the North, to the very porch of his country, so Vladimir Putin has also been provoked by the aggression of the King of the North today in striving to take Ukraine, the porch of Russia, as a NATO nation. Russia's foreign minister said that Russia had now reached their boiling point. Not only had Russia sustained losses from the collapse of the Soviet Union carried out by the United States of America, but now NATO's expansion eastward up to the very border of Russia with the intention to take Ukraine tipped Russia over the edge. In 2018, the United States of America for the first time ever supplied tens of millions of dollars of lethal aid to Ukraine, adding more fuel to the fire of provocation. And at the NATO summit of 2021, the United States of America reaffirmed their promise that Ukraine would become a NATO nation. The very next event in Daniel 11, after the provocation of the King of the South, is war. Just as Ptolemy, the King of the South, fought with the King of the North in the region of Raphia, just outside the borders of Egypt, so the King of the South today, Russia, began war on the 24th of February 2022 in the region of Ukraine, just outside the borders of Russia. As Ukraine engages in the current war, it fights on the side of the King of the North, holding and using the American weapons supplied in 2018 and also being supported by the $1.35 billion which the United States of America has funded to Ukraine since the war began. Under the umbrella of NATO, the United States of America has been leading out in the supply, funding and fueling of the war against the Russian army. Just as the battle of the two superpowers of the past occurred in the region of Raphia, so the conflict today is occurring in the region of Ukraine. Though the battlefield is Ukraine today, the war is really a battle of two superpowers, the United States of America and Russia. Just as the Cold War was fought in Germany between the East and the West, so this war is being fought in Ukraine between America and Russia. Turning back to Daniel 11, it is interesting to note that in the history of Daniel 11, 5-10, it was the King of the North who had initiated most of the aggressive expansion. Likewise in our time, and contrary to the popular opinion, the main aggressor behind the conflict is the King of the North today. But who will come out victor? Daniel 11 holds the answer. And as the history of Daniel 11 verse 11 repeats, Russia in the Battle of Ukraine will be victorious in gaining their demands against NATO. However, we will see in part 6 of this series that Ptolemy's victory over the King of the North is only temporary, for the King of the North returns when many nations will come together with yet another war against Russia. Friends, the law of self-sacrifice is the law of self-preservation. It is because Jesus would not save himself on the cross that his kingdom was secured on earth, and the sinner has hope for salvation. In seeking to save itself, Ukraine will be unsuccessful against the Russian invasion and only prove its own ruin more disastrously. And as we delve deeper into Daniel 11 and the history that is repeating in our time, we will see that in seeking to save itself from NATO expansion, Russia will later bring ruin on itself. And the United States of America, in aggressively seeking to expand and conquer, will too bring disaster and ruin on itself. Is it your desire to make a sacrifice in this life to preserve yourself for the world to come? The law of self-sacrifice is the law of self-preservation. Russia in Daniel 11, end of part 4.